r/Nosleep. Posted by u/ChristianWallis. I'm an Arctic explorer and I found an abandoned toy workshop. Part 1. When did they arrive? Maggie appeared through the blizzard like a ghost, her footsteps and profile having been hidden by the sheets of snow and ice falling all around us. I didn't jump, and once I realized she was looking at the cigarette in my hand, I merely nodded and offered her one. She surprised me by taking it and we stood quietly, eyes fixed on the spot on the horizon where we knew the ship was lying perfectly preserved. "I had HQ send a drone over with more appropriate supplies," I said. "So we're definitely staying then?" "Sebastian must be beside himself," Maggie replied, following it up with a quiet chuckle. "He's certainly looking itchy," I replied. "But personally I'd be fine never looking another piece of suet in the eye." "Utter torture," she groaned, shaking her head. "I've been jogging 10 miles every morning since I was 17, but these last few days have been something else. He just thrives off it though, doesn't he?" "It's his shtick," I replied. "What he does. He only agreed because he thought we'd never find the damn thing, and it'd be 2 weeks of solid trekking through Arctic winter. But he has his own fundraising to do, and he needs to work up interest with littler treks like this one." 5,000 calories a day, Maggie said. "I don't know how anyone could do it for fun." "Well, at least the new supplies are better suited to camp life. Plus," I gestured with the cigarette in my hand as it burned down to the final few embers, "we can slip in a few little amenities now we don't have to haul every last pound behind us." Maggie took a final draw and handed me the butt when she was done. I had an empty can of Coke I was using to keep them in, personally unwilling to throw them willy-nilly onto the ground. "The ice is safe," she told me, dropping a bomb like it was nothing. "In fact, it's a few miles thick. We've just got the full satellite data through and, well, it's quite intriguing." "Why's that?" I asked. "It's not alone. There's something else a day's hike north. Hard, hollow, and big. I wanted to double-check before I told you. It's certainly a very odd finding." "Well, we've got the ship to explore for now," I said. "If Sebastian feels like it, he can burn off some calories checking out the second signal." I watched Maggie disappear back into the gray wind before returning to my own tent. Sitting down on my cot I contemplated the news she just delivered. My eyes drifted to the horizon again and again as I turned the words over in my mind. The ship was safe to board. The ship I'd spent years writing about, publishing papers on, researching. Hell, there was a scale model of the damn thing in my living room I'd made by hand as a young postdoc. The Pinafore was lost with all hands during a barely discussed attempt at finding the Northwest Passage. Standing at 80 feet long it was a caravel, and thus one of the first European ships capable of oceanic crossings. I'd spent years postulating that it was still frozen in the ice, just like the infamous ghost ship, the HMS Terror. A comparison I happily played up after the success of the fictional novel and TV show based on the Lost Franklin expedition. One wealthy benefactor later and I was equipped with more money than my whole department had seen in years, along with the testy, but experienced, guide Sebastian. And somehow, against all odds, we found it after a brutal 7-day hike. Ever since I'd first spotted the mast from miles away, I'd been vibrating with barely contained excitement. Knowing it was out there just waiting, well, I had no hope of getting to sleep. I stood up from my cot and grabbed a torch but kept it off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark as I checked camp for any signs of life. Certain that I was alone, I began my walk. It wasn't a long way to go. We'd camped a few hundred meters away to keep clear in case the ship was at risk of cracking the ice, unlikely as that was. Still, it was dark and I got turned pretty bad after a few minutes. Even with my torch I started to feel the first twinges of panic, but I kept at it until, after 20 minutes of nervous fumbling, I finally saw the mast once more. It was a barely glimpsed shape in the dark, a patch of white overhead that caught my torch and made me jump. Lowering the light brought the rest of the ship into view, and for a split second I was dumbstruck with awe. The ship was close enough to nearly touch, and while I've seen bigger ships before and since, something about it made me feel breathtakingly small. It was as if the groaning of the ice beneath my feet belonged to the ship, and not the weather, like it was some great nautical beast crying out to me. This ship had left shore in 1543 and never returned. And yet the word Pinafore was still written along its side, engraved in gorgeous detail on a plinth as long as I am tall. And right there, just a few feet away, was a ladder that enabled entry. I tried the wood and could have cried when I found it held my weight. I got 2 rungs up before I fell back down and bloodied my lip on the hull. I didn't let it stop me. Even as the weather threatened to freeze me to the spot, I clumsily forced my way overboard and collapsed onto the deck, shouting my laughter into the blizzard. No one would be able to hear me anyway. The ship was like black volcanic rock encased in glittering ice. Here and there bits of rigging and wood jutted out, so cold I'd imagine it would tear the skin right of my hand if I touched it. I marveled at the sight of it all and made a slow and deliberate circle of the deck, letting out a tremendous laugh of joy when I saw the helm was still intact, wheel and all. I thought I would stop there, but as the minutes ticked on it wasn't enough. And when my foot caught the trapdoor that leading to below deck, I found my hand moving towards the latch before I'd had a single conscious thought. It wasn't easy to open, taking maybe an hour or two. But all things considered, it wasn't as hard as it ought to have been. And when the door finally slammed open, landing on the deck with a terrible thunderclap, it revealed a set of steps descending into total darkness. At the sight of it, I felt a small catch form at the back of my throat. The rigging of the ship had been snapped, the beams and masts broken and gouged, the wood splintered. I was walking into a tomb. The Arctic is an alien place, the geography profoundly different to what we're used to. Great obelisks of glistening white rock rise meters into the air, walls of snow lie ready to collapse, and a landscape rendered in pure blank white appears to the human eyes faintly abstract, almost surreal. The ground is not solid rock, but floating ice, and below it lies one of the most hostile and unknown oceans in the world. An ocean that is forever ever cut off from sunlight. I took one last look around at the starlit deck and descended into the ship, the roaring wind fading to a whistle as I ducked below. The stairs led to a small hold with a single corridor that carried onto the fore of the ship, where I knew I'd find the captain's quarters. My intention was to head right there and ignore the little things along the way, except what lay in wait for me in the hold was no little thing. I screamed when I first saw the head. It was a gaunt, eyeless, leathery thing twisted into a frozen grin of pain. A gnarled hand reached out towards me and I let out another shriek and fell backwards, sending the torch spinning out where it finally settled on the monstrosity before me. The scream died as I realized slowly that the thing was not moving, and it was not a single thing. A dozen heads lay crammed together, arms and fingerless hands shoved out in awkward angles, as if they were desperately groping for something that lay just out of reach. It was a pile of bodies, their limbs and torsos interwoven in a bone-breaking display of torture and mutilation. I let the mortal terror drain away but lost all desire to stay for a moment longer. I grabbed the torch with quivering hands and turned back towards the way I came. That was when the hatch slammed shut, and I found another scream of terror rising in my throat. "Couldn't have called me?" Craig said as I sat shivering under a foil blanket. I was clutching a small cup of hot chocolate, which Craig supplemented with a shot of brandy when no one else was looking. I thanked him with an appreciative nod. "You know, I would have given anything to be there with you," he added. "Then you're as stupid as he is," Maggie said, stepping down onto the ice as Sebastian started to follow her. "If I hadn't wanted another cigarette, I would never have realized you were missing. You'd have been trapped in there all night with that thing." Craig looked at Maggie and she nodded. "Holy shit," he said. "I've gotta go look." "Let him," I said just as Maggie went to stop him. She rolled her eyes but let him go and Craig rushed off, catching Sebastian just as he took the final step down from the ship. "This could have gone so much worse," she said, expecting no reply. I imagined that would be the end of the matter, and I looked up eagerly when Sebastian sidled up to join the conversation. I owe you a bit of an apology there, David," he said, looking a little too pale around the edges. "When I heard you screaming, I thought it had been the hatch slamming shut and you were just scared. But Jesus, that is. No one wants to be locked in the dark with that thing. What the hell is it?" "The crew?" I suggested. "Shame we didn't bring any biologists with us." "Your toys can help with that, right?" Sebastian said. "You've got drones coming and going so often we could set up a department store. We can take samples and return, maybe set up a video feed," Maggie replied. "As a meteorologist, I definitely feel a little out of my wheelhouse. What about you?" She asked me the last part, and I tried to think of whether anything I'd ever encountered came close to what I saw in the hold of that ship. When nothing came to mind, I shook my head. "One fucked up Christmas tree," Sebastian said with a dark laugh, and I felt a shiver run down my back at his words. It really had resembled some kind of tree, and I filed the thought away in my head hoping it wouldn't pop back up the next time I put my own tree up in my living room. "Hey," he cried. "Maybe you can hook the drones up to it and just fly the whole thing back to town." Sebastian really didn't like the drones. If he'd had his own way he would have had us doing the expedition with dogs and seal fur boots just like his ancestors. "That reminds me," I said. "Maggie has something to show you. I think you might like it. We were told the worst thing to do was to touch or move it, So we didn't. The mountain of frozen flesh and withered bone was obscured from view with some makeshift curtains Craig threw together, and we carried on working like it wasn't there. Craig and Maggie took photos and made an inventory of every object we could find, carefully labeling and categorizing each tong and blade for later expeditions. I tried to pore through these items to find something that might give a clue to the ship's final fate. A dozen or so men crewed the ship in its prime, including a surgeon, a cook, a smith, and a cartographer. We found faded broken letters that spoke of mothers and wives, small figures sculpted from whalebone, and ancient bottles of homebrewed spirits stashed away under pillows. The ship's surgeon and resident scholar even had quite the collection of shells that he'd carefully labeled. Here and there we also found a patch of floor stained suspiciously in the dark, or a blade embedded in a door or wall, but we tried to ignore the implication of violence. The captain's quarters were, well, they were odd. I concluded that the ship had disappeared close to Christmas given the sprig of holly fixed to the ceiling. A small concession a captain had made to the season. But the desk was smashed in two, rope and twine lay all around the floor, and drag marks were visible along the wood along with a few scattered fingernails. There was also a discharged musket under the desk, along with a solitary half-gnawed human finger that lay close by. In the doctor's quarters I saw that the cabinets were bare of the usual oils and tinctures employed at the time, useless as they would have been, though his diary spoke of nothing spreading amongst the crew. There was a lifetime of work, and the details we captured guaranteed more funding than I could have ever imagined. We had our ghost ship, we had our thrilling and creepy details, and we had one great big inexplicable pile of corpses that would boggle some of the greatest researchers in the university. It was a little scary, but otherwise it was good news. Sebastian had departed the day before and checked in regularly for the first 12 hours or so. After that he went silent, which we put down to the poor weather or his general single-mindedness. At the 24-hour mark Maggie became a little itchy, and when she pointed out the silence to Craig and I, we found ourselves sharing her concern. We decided to try calling him on the radio and waited silently for his reply. What came was a discordant series of clicks and heavy breathing. "Sebastian?" Maggie asked. "Are you okay?" But there was only the strange hiss of the radio broken by the occasional breath or scrape. "Sebastian?" she cried. "Please respond?" We tried for hours until, eventually, his radio stopped returning any signal. Craig figured it may have died, or maybe Sebastian had turned it off and started ignoring us. But something about the strange noises had left us all feeling a little nervous. Maggie suggested that he'd just activated the radio by accident and we were hearing the sounds of his walking, but the breathing felt close and ragged, almost animalistic like a man approaching death. Still, it was the best theory we had, and we agreed to wait a little longer. The following 12 hours were tense. Eventually we stopped working and returned to camp, where we tried to contact Sebastian with a more powerful radio and updated HQ to let them know. The ship that trailed us along the coast sent a few drones over the area Sebastian was meant to be and reported no visible signs of the man. No big surprise there, we figured, given just how hard it'd be to find anything in the tundra. But the pit in my stomach grew heavier with each hour that passed without us hearing back from our guide. After 48 hours it was decided we'd have to go look for Sebastian ourselves. We were moderately experienced in hiking and the spot shouldn't have been more than a 6-hour ride away. It was Sebastian who had insisted on making the journey by foot, always eager to push himself to the limit, and chances were it had led him to some kind of misfortune.